Hello everyone, today we talk about an evergreen, a classic, right, typical sort of introductory chapter in every medieval history manual to, in fact, a particular part of the migration era in the east, right, of the European continent, mostly concerning the waves of nomadic peoples that abated themselves on, in fact, great parts of Europe and prompting others, as you know, in a domino effect to move as well, including the emergence of the same Slavs, right? And this is one of those videos that routinely happen for, as you know, my very non-Apollonian entrusting of the same topics to fate, as opposed to, as a veritable hero, like twisting that same fate and deciding directly what topic to make. Actually, it's part of the wall because I sort of, selected the stuff before, and of course this is a joke. But I say it because it's one of those topics that really require a lot of attention in the actual details, but that are, I think, so very important, say even more important probably, to look at as the whole picture, right? This is not just about now the migration era, the Slavs, etc., but it's also about that, because of course there are political, historical, cultural reasons why, of course, like socialism happened, right? And one cannot really eliminate it from history, together with all the damage that this made in so many ways in the storytelling, right? That, of course, was at some point like weaponized by this side or the other, as always history is, really. But and that obviously finds at least a pinch of truth in every position, at least. That is always about a bit like the half full or half empty glass, right? It's always a matter of perspective of, no, it's more like this, no, it's more like that. You have no idea, and actually I think you may, if you have, especially being around YouTube, especially since not really the earliest day, but say up to a few years ago, where everything was much less policed in a way, and in every single damn video about not just topics like these that actually, as I often explain, were not even discussed up to some years ago. I started with a few others, and now they have become that proverbial evergreen. That, in fact, even, I don't know, under a World War II video, like we have this storms of actual battles taking place because of all the, say, most disparate sort of political, ethnic, national, even religious, non-religious, fascist, communist clashes, histories that are definitely still there, right? I understand in a sense that like this is perhaps not overwhelmingly evident, perhaps in the American side of the internet. At least it's not ingrained in the same way, in the same as in the same places where this normally springs from in Europe, from within the actual places that lived things like, let's say the terrifying, right? Say the darkest pages, even within the same Europe, where pretty much bad things happen everywhere. But let's say in the most terrible ones in Central, in Eastern Europe, and that, of course, has never really died out. Like much of what I think of our problems today do not derive much from the fact that we discuss these things or we do it and with that sort of subjective angst, rather because of the actual mark that these left in the way people sort of inform their own identity, the idea of themselves, and of their countries, etc., in a world that actually is declining pretty sharply in the actual historical awareness, even of events as close as World War II as it was for us millennials, I would say, just grown up as kids into that mythology, if you want, in a way or another, but still in a fairly At least it depends on the countries, right? And I can't speak, of course, for all. But so you can imagine in comparison also how, say, distant and mythological in so many ways the migration era also was, and for the same foundation of so many identities and so many, let's say, even ways of seeing history itself that vary, in fact, from community for what happened back then. And as you know, I have a pretty large amount of videos dealing mostly with Eurasian steppe warfare, which I wouldn't suspect, it wasn't really one of my priorities when I started Schwerpunkt, but it turned out particularly relevant and appreciated, and that, I must confess, I also grew, if not passion for, like, I can't really say because I'm not an expert in a strict sense, compared to my field of research, etc. But it's one of those topics that the more you look at and the more helps you dimensioning really so much in the history of civilization, not just for Europe. Like, who were these steppe peoples? Like, why did they exist? Like, why was there a central world and why a nomadic one? And say, aside from the environment, what did this mean in their own belief, in their own actions? Why in the migration era things unfolded the way they did? Why, in fact, this outcome? Why this national settlements? And opening, therefore, all that kind of questions that, in my opinion, like, are not really answered because they don't fit the main narrative that both the left and the right are pursuing in this time in history, and mostly the most, I think, self-evident macroscopic aspect of the important divide existing between Eastern and Western Europe that gets often sort of eliminated in favor of, say, other divides that in many ways do not actually reflect the most objective, the civilizational indicators, and that can get pretty weird pretty fast. So one of the tasks of a united European historical education, of course, is to come to grips with this particular time in history and sort of resolving, essentially, because there is not really that much to battle over when we talk about it. This is the malaise that I perceived. As I was saying at the beginning, it's not much people being proud of their ancestry or their, say, historical knowledge, of appreciating the story of their own country, but quite the opposite, right? What I've been exposed continuously ever since, like, I accessed the internet in my life, and revolving around this historical topic, is that people sort of express their own malaise, whatever, like politically, personally, social, whatever, like mostly pretending to know history, like having this angry shout at things that evidently they don't understand themselves. So you need a sort of call for help that reverses itself against some sort of made-up enemies that can take various forms, and that actually reveal just how much they don't know about their own. And the interesting aspect is that they get particularly attached to this topic exactly because they say it's more complicated than it sounds, psychologically speaking, but paradoxically, the greater the attachment, the greater the ignorance toward the same topic. That's something I always noticed. If you realize it, I don't talk too much. I mean, I do talk often about my own country in these videos, but it's not that I'm making, like, of course there is some attachment, some bias, some subjectivity, but I'm not making, and you see it also in the general history, say the general type of documentation of narrative that I use. I don't actually present history, in spite of its terrifying, terrifyingly bloody background and substance and action, and I'm a military historian, in, say, oppositive terms. I can't say that I don't talk in conflictual terms, because you have to understand who prevailed over one another. You can't really tell, for example, the history of the migration era, simply pretending this was, a complex process because, it's difficult to define culture, changes were so gradual, this kind of, narrative that, essentially just the left habituated us to, and eliminating the evenemential, the sort of like, there was freaking people that move over and out and conquered it, and there's no way around that in any ways. This is a great trigger, for example, for those that really want to get angry for those things. Of course, the outcome can also be different. As you know, there is a series of mine about Latin Germanic Europe that points out how even if the Romans had apparently been exhausted and sort of lost to the Germans, at the end of the day, managed to culturally absorb the Germans, allowing them to found new polities that are largely at the basis, we see also in the West, narrowly meant, of like the major countries, not just in Europe today, but say historical hindsight, like the most important ones anyway, and that is that positive take that you can. How can, if you descend from all of them, like how can you actually? You should hate a part of yourself. you should hate a part, and that's also what happens. Oddly enough, right? In fact, in those people who always complain, notice that, right? They are, say, racial purists, even though they know too well, looking at themselves in the mirror, that that's not a thing, right? And or at least even if that, I'm not saying that that's not important, because as you know, I definitely talk history also in racialistic terms, and that does make a difference. Whether you like it or not, there are different dimensions in terms of, like, again, absolute values that are also traditionally based on the capacity of a spiritual race to, say, transfigure your own genetics, which apparently, from an epigenetical point of view, is the actual scientific deal. I mean, it does happen that way, but it's mostly hiding. Like, it's mostly actually revealing the fact that most of these people do not have the palest idea of what is civilizational comparison, right? They just think that, and this is typical especially in post-socialist countries, because they were terrorized and paranoid, and you don't fix it in a couple of generations. I know it sounds harsh, but again, this is also what the villainies of the culturally inferior, like the socially failing in the same West are starting to buy as for the same reason, complete lack of historical education, like this sense of who were the good guys or bad guys, just based on, well, depending on what the contingent narrative really is. But it's this extreme paranoia of considering your own country essentially as surrounded by a fog of war, not knowing anything about the rest, and just concentrating on yourself, and that's it. Like, eventually getting cognitively dissonant when you meet with the rest of the world, and in spite of the fact that, again, we're an open world, there is the internet, naive people assume, as we all did as youngsters, that, every place in the world reasons the way we do, or even every person next door, like, even does. That's not the case. There is a rigid, violently, and traumatically courageous hierarchy of people's value, culture. There is no way around that, right? And history is the only way to get that. Right? If you don't make your homework, if you think that the only thing that actually matters is your yard, by default, you do not know what is the objective value of your yard, because your yard is in the universe. The Catholic tradition, pre-existing the same Christianity, was exclusively, by the way, for all these peoples, based on the same identical doctrine about it. And so this is the most blatant admission of utter ignorance and absolute betrayal of the same values of your ancestors, if that's the thing that you care about the most in general, which could even make sense of course, if you from tradition assume of the fact that, of course, like, the older the better in a divine descendants of, say, still, like, these people sinned for you to have degenerated to this point. So it's also something you should think, who were your ancestors and where were they in this, in fact, hierarchy and what they were doing, right? So that's how history should really be seen. And you understand that the unitary perspective is the only one to give value morally and scientifically to anything, right? And that's why this should be. And that's, again, people who disagree with this view are just also the ones that would like, of course, to pretend that they are monads suspensed in a vacuum and that nothing happens except when, Soviets send tanks to occupy their country when they realized magically that they were already under somebody else's heel, right? So I know I'm brutal. I have, by the way, dear friends here also got from Schwerpunkt that can really relate from, I can't name them, from Hungary, from Czech Republic. I had a Polish girlfriend, and I've always been very interested in this stuff because it seemed to me that there is so much unlocked potential in these countries that we don't even realize, like how much they could contribute actually, right? Not the way we see today, because it's not just by saying that you legitimately don't want illegal immigrants or even immigrants at large that makes you a hero. That's not how divine transfiguration happens. That's just a tiny step. Then the let's say the distance between you and God is a completely different thing. If you even deny an imperial authority or you attribute it to powers that are not even able, right, to be up to their on paper like name and lie as a national identity every single step of the way, well, again, that's not exactly the target that we're reaching here. So in this video I will not, of course, be talking about pretty innovative groundbreaking information that we discovered. I don't know, that the Magyars were actually Brazilian, and so now there is all different, genetic. No, like, of course, the history as it was, unfortunately, like we know it just the way it is. There was not too much in fact, the very few that we know, that few in relative terms, but still, in fact, very meagerly. Also because of the lack of written accounts, which unfortunately archaeology cannot compare with. Right, it's not that just this field is about archaeology, that archaeology solves problems regarding like the actual history, the political, the military. No, right? We know more or less what these material cultures were even before archaeology, discovered, I don't know, stuff in the last half a century more. That did not change basically of an inch what we already knew from a basically, let's say, historical, political, and de facto cultural point of view. And that's also like an important aspect of the philosophy and method of history that should be looked at into some greater care, because of the aforementioned reason. That is to say, the way this can't be simply hijacked for other purposes, as it was done, right, historically. Because, of course, you have to appreciate also, as we were saying at the beginning, the different level of historiographical development of a country or another. It's just, I don't know, it's not to shoot on the Red Cross, but just to make banal examples. It's of course it's obvious that the Balkan history, Turkish history is not particularly developed in the first place, right? Why? Because these countries had another type of history that did not allow for that sort of unequivocally, large, florid, sound, objective, scientifically standard, let's say, amount of historiography, like, I don't know, in Britain or in France, right? And the fact, again, that in Britain and France, I don't know, there is such a general crisis and malcontent, for obviously microscopical reasons, does not mean at all that, of course, what is being produced there is not overwhelmingly more valid, reliable, and just completely at another level compared to so many other. We'll talk about this stuff. As you know, I was about to marry a Serbian archaeologist, so it means that I stepped, I was just one literal step away from hell, and I did not know, or at least I was so naive, and I wanted maybe, I don't know, I'm masochistic or something, but, we will see eventually what God has in store. By the way, I feel sick. I don't know what I have, so that's pretty appropriate. No, I'm actually pretty healthy. I think I just had not slept. I'm overly dramatic regarding this kind of divine wrath. Never underestimate that, right? Never underestimate God's love as much as His wrath, right? Which is also beautiful to pronounce in English, by the way. Now. In my country's language, I prefer the term fury, which is sort of much better suited for it. It's very good to pronounce in that way. Now, aside from this, as I was saying before, it's not much about just the environment, right? The ecological realm that makes the differences during the migration era. But as you understand, there is a reason why some people live nomadically and others don't. It's of course not just a matter of there is also some semi-nomadism in between. During the migration era, we say I don't know, the Roman Empire was essentially a century area, and that followed the boundaries of, for example, the vineyard, right? This is obvious still in countries that were crossed by that, the parts of Germany where you can grow wine. Well, no, not entirely, but still, they do follow generally the Roman boundaries. You have some, probably the lack for that reason, outside of this realm of particular substances that can be produced to preserve large amounts of grains, for example, for supporting an army. So statehood basically does not exist, or at least it grows civilization, because humans engineer this world, and it's mostly their reaction to it that makes this limit rather than the environment. In fact, humans know how to mess up everything by themselves without anything concerned with climate change. And there is not need to use that, historically speaking, even if probably there is, of course, a connection to. But it was overly abused, as you know, especially in the later decades, in which we, say, at least liberal historiography began to convince ourselves that late antiquity and the migration era are the single most important thing that matters. But just in a way of everything was mixed, and everything was so open, and it was like a melting pot, and just at some point climate changed, and so everything went down. And yes, it's not really about the clash with the wars or the dimensional history. Let's look at what was everyday life like in this place, or just hyper fixating on single surely iconic historical figures, but say disregarding basically not just other parts of history, the ones, certain aspects of late antiquity as well. Of course, I'm exaggerating a bit the characterization here. There is an immensity of stuff on late antiquity, also pretty good quality, but there has been this sort of cultural tendency. Surely there was a great level of cultural difference also among various peoples, but as we were saying, it was essentially this belt around the sanitary word strictly meant, and then that at least put itself in motion during the migration here are mostly pushed by probably the nomadic element. So we're talking mostly the Germans, this Germanic populations, and many others that had been just carried along. And this would be the case also for the Slavs, not just under the Germans, but as you know, especially under the Turks fundamentally, that up to that point had actually been senators. Like the Germanic tribes of Tacitus were, yes, pretty unstable in general, but Germans were essentially farmers, agriculturers. Things don't even change in that strict sense, because these peoples, when they organize themselves in confederacies and they are on the move, they don't abandon that sort of sanitary lifestyle, right? We look at these migrations as if they had been just, these peoples were always on the move. No, right? Most of these moves, first of all, were very gradual, very, very slow. They could take centuries. And others could be instead that fast, for the obvious reason that they could travel that fast, and just for settling in another sanitary place. The picture is extremely different instead for those nomadic peoples that had always lived in the steppes proper, and that literally were always on the move, right? They were on the move because they didn't have enough resources to grab like locally, so they had to move from pasture to pasture, also with a high level of militarization down to the average subject, if anything, for instinct of survival. And it would be even more unstable in terms of cohesion, of actual grip, also of some, even when you look at some confederacies. This is true also for, generally speaking, the Germans. But the nomads, of course, like they settle at some point, but they don't have a real state that can really coerce everybody. Like they can mostly summon them for military expeditions, they can threaten them, they can, in a sense, use a lot of deterrence, but they are also condemned in an almost cyclical way to the softening up, to sort of exhaustion and gentrification, especially as they have grabbed the best pastures, as they have grown richer, and just to be taken over by the next younger, fresher race that sort of crushes them. They were of barbarians, of primitives, even for steppe standards, that eventually end up sort of exhausting even faster than those. Like if you look at all histories like that, but also in the sanitary world, the older the times are sort of the most long living, right? The various powers, then always faster cycles of destruction and of instability, historical perspective. The steppes follow like this pattern. Like the Indo-European steppes, for example, had achieved substantial levels of civilization for nomadic standards. In fact, turning to something more sanitary, actually, semi-sanitary, before being eventually crushed by Turco-Mongol populations. And yes, there were lots of Indo-European descendants from moving alongside these groups, but I have a lot of, Indo, I don't know how to define it. Here we do make Indo-European history to an extent, but this sort of historical denial that at some point the Indo-European steppes were taken over by the Turks, and that Avars were Aryan people, and this kind of memes that go around again have mostly to do with mental disturbances of contemporary people, as to having anything to do with the actual history that emerges from a time in sort of really unequivocal way regarding the essentials. So if you look at the Eurasian steppes, you realize that this also is a pretty wide area, like especially longitudinally speaking. It's not a very latitudinally extended corridor, especially the more east you go, but it stretches from China to the Carpathian Mountains, or rather to Hungary, right? That is the most developed and prosperous part, by the way, of this vast and arid region. This aspect should not be underestimated because, of course, the steppes have different ways they sort of fade, right? And in the west, we have the Carpathian Basin, the Middle Danube that were never particularly civilized areas. Yes, the Dacians had important mineral resources. The Romans conquered Dacia, in fact, because of that reason. But if you look at properly the areas where, in fact, the nomads, unsurprisingly, will settle, Huns, Avars, Magyars, etc. This is the actual steppe. It's the actual Hungarian steppe. That was also a very militarized frontier in Roman times without any, say, dramatically large phenomenon of urbanization nor of agricultural productivity. Essentially, the only truly developed area, like by, say, antique standards, like of city, rich countryside, etc., was Moesia. So we are still essentially in the Middle Danube, today's region of Serbia, etc., that in fact did sustain such civilization, but it was also very much exposed to the steppes attacks. And actually, one of the reasons why Dacia was conquered was exactly also to shelter better Moesia from. I made a video about that province for the series about the Roman ones. Again, not an overwhelmingly developed place either, right? But to make the long story short, like the places where most nomads would settle in history, also considering the regression of antiquity in a truly geographical sense in terms of that sustainability. Look at the Byzantine Empire, right? The Balkans were not so populated and urbanized in Byzantine times as they had been in Roman ones, right? And so you have the Bulgars settling, in fact, in what becomes Bulgaria, the Magyars, Hungars do the same with Hungary. So places that had always been some sort of frontier, and that were a big deal, however, for the nomads because they were more advanced than the places they came from. And yet they were framed, this is really the peculiarity of it, within much more sanitary groups that were also importantly tough, right? There is an interesting comparison I've made with in some video, I think recently, about the Huns, the Guptas, etc., and the fact that China was the only true civilization capable of rivaling with Europe. India wasn't, for example, at this point. Was, however, also more enclosed within itself. It's as if, like in China, if you take off like the upper part as a sort of dam, like everybody can penetrate it, because the people are somehow sheltered, spent. There is a sclerotic aristocracy that basically controls everything. The people are fundamentally demilitarized. Europe is not like that. I mean, the expansion of the Roman Empire that would naturally give rise, as with any empire, to some sort of exhaustion at the end of the day. And this is what happened during the migration era. But we have seen how often, like, after all, Romanity was not really something that collapsed per se. It was something that rather transformed and even accepted. This is especially evident in Latin Germanic Europe. The new, say, juridical identity deriving still from the idea of the survival of an empire and a beautiful synthesis that went on to eventually re-expand dramatically in the High Middle Ages and taking over the surroundings. In Europe, you can have, however, in the so-called Barbaricum, in that semi-nomadic part we're talking about, pretty, in fact, tough, militarized tribes that, again, can't achieve much better than that. They can form kingdoms only when they actually settle in Roman territory, but they are also a sort of compact, tough, courageous place where to simply step in. Right? As Westerners, I've always said this. It seems that when we teach history, we have this sense of precarious balance for everything. It is not a negative aspect. Civilizations definitely do risk that. They do have these moments of crisis, but we tend in the narrative to always, in fact, also concentrate ourselves in that paranoid way, because by scale everybody does it, and actually the West is the country that does it the least, right? I mean, look at what the Chinese do, how they teach history, or the Russians teach history. And still, however, discarding, in fact, how actually tough the West was throughout its entire history, and how can you simply conquer it? I made a video about the Mongol invasion of Europe that essentially explains how it would have not been feasible for the Mongols to actually conquer Europe. And that is still an object of content to some extent, that in my opinion derives from the simple lack of, say, it's not much about the size of Europe demographically or economically. Like, if you combine the two things, you could also get an interesting picture. But in that sense, in the sheer moral compaction of its people. And the fact that this part of Eurasia had sort of overly exceeded its own boundaries, historically speaking. I mean, look at the Roman Empire, look at the medieval civilization. The West ruled the entire surroundings, directly or indirectly. There was no way around this. We've seen it just the other days with the Italian markets and banking during the Middle Ages. We've seen it in the Crusades. We've seen it in the general superiority of the Frankish world as it had evolved, encompassing, in fact, most of what we define as narrowly Western, even within the same Europe. And when you are a nomadic people that definitely does not have many options even about what he does in terms of, say, entering in civilizational territory as a wedge, right? Settling in Europe always leads unavoidably to sedentarization, right? And not also to some sort of, yes, there is some similar process in China, but to a different extent, because in China you have, say, at least some dynasties that maintain their sort of oil fields in the steppes, right? The bulk of their military, right? The pastors from which they could launch massive expeditions all across the steppes and beyond. That's one thing. There was always that sort of contact, because as we said, the Chinese frontier was also, let's say, was more permeable than Europe's. Europe's has all these different obstacles within the same populations. And as a consequence, you don't actually find a steppe empire in Europe that sort of maintains its own control of some steppes areas in a direct sense. Direct, of course, is the keyboard here, because you can argue that, yes, the Huns or the Avars at some point up shortly, like after they migrated, they settled down, they did have some suzerainty on peoples that remained in the steppes, because it was just their habit to make some sort of deals in case of failure of the migration, for coming back. This is something that the Germans did to some point when the Longobards, for example, migrated from the Pannonian Basin. When the Avars arrived, they sort of made the same deal, like, if we fail in Italy, you Avars will let us return to Pannonian. And the Avars, yes, we will, which was actually much more complicated. Fortunately, the Longobards, made it into Italy, but to a much greater future that, of course, that any step there could offer. And you have a quite interesting dichotomy in this sense, for which in Europe, whatever settles either vanishes because nomadism was so ingrained in itself that it cannot resist on a prolonged settlement, and or in fact they successfully turn into sedentary powers. I mean, look at the Magyars, or the Bulgars, right? The latter in a bit lesser way, but so they're also sort of less developed areas to some extent. Now again, comparatively it's complicated, but it's the most important way you can appreciate history, in my opinion. Another aspect that I think is interesting to picture is how, of course, in spite of the pivotal, dramatic sort of era-making sort of collapse of the Roman Empire, the migration phenomena that we thus get to know mostly after what we call the migration era, as if in fact these peoples had ever stopped moving in the steppes, is that of course there had been various groups of nomads emerging in the first half of the first millennium BC, from before, and way before that, like for that matter, representing this highly specialized subsistence, say communities centered around livestock rearing, where agricultural was either, as we've seen, impossible or insufficient to sustain due to the unforgiving environment. And the nomadic lifestyle of these populations was, for this reason, fundamentally tied to horses, right? Because they had to just herd cattle, they had to be fast out there, and there wasn't much of a cover. In the first place, you had to just be mobile as it got, and mostly relying on attack, because fortifications did exist, but there wasn't enough surplus, as we've seen, until you get properly in the sanitary war to effectively stop the only forces you can grow in this area, that is, say, mounted ones, at least considering the intrinsic advantage that they have on infantry, and the fact that even at this point the poorest of the subjects normally had a horse, and or at least depended could fight on horseback, right? Whereas we've seen infantrymen in the steppes as well, and not just simply the dismounted horsemen. But the steppe is complex. It does have some sanitary areas. It's not just like a completely homogeneous steppe. And so you have interesting hybrids for that matter. By the way, the developments in the nomadic art of war stemmed greatly from the contact with the sanitary peoples, right? Because these were, let's say, the nomads were somehow dependent on the surplus that they could get from their raiding. They of course developed their own way of war internally, but for example, emergence of cataphract units, right? That's something that fundamentally the Sakas developed out of the meeting with the Macedonians of Alexander the Great on the Syr-Dryad, and the obvious superiority of the sanitary armies compared to them. So there is all, as you understand, also a political and social intertwinement in the steppe that regulates this. There were three primary needs, if you want, shaping the distinct dynamics of the steppes peoples. From one side, you have the imperative of continuous migration, as we've seen, to secure new pastures and follow the seasonal rhythms. There were just so a certain amount of things you could do, especially the largest your power was. And then, for example, moving all those horses entailed that, say, if you didn't move in the humid season, you literally the army would disintegrate, would collapse. This is a problem that existed also in the sanitary world. We talked about Mongolian logistics, and let's say a regional force cannot do without a regional water supply that can be found only along major rivers, for example. And you can't really get very distant from them, because even in very sort of it's the way you can access that water in order to satisfyingly quench your army's daily thirst. That really matters. Just think about epidemics. I mean, even in places like Bohemia, the Roman legions needed to be close to a large pool of water to survive. It's not like in Bohemia it's hard to find water, but the miracle of the rain was happening exactly because the Germans had managed to at least deprive the Romans of enough water access to put them in a really bad situation. It was reversed anyway. The second aspect is that there was the need to defend livestock against natural and human threats, a requirement that ultimately led to a certain degree of militarization, as we were pointing out. And thirdly, there was the necessity of maintaining exchange channels with sedentary farmers to acquire products not readily available in the steppes, which couldn't really be done just through raiding, right? So of course there was an aptness, also physically speaking, for somebody living under the weather practically in a constant way, and or at least having a physique capable of being always on horseback, and that's in surviving in the wilderness, because also many of these people literally lived in very, especially like the majority of this population, because there was again normally a central clan that was the richest, that had the better access to resources, managed in fact this concentration of loot and traded goods. But most subjects, like the horse archer, typical, like the unarmored one of these armies, say numerical backbone, is just a desperate person most of the time. So they're not literally starving to death, otherwise they would have disappeared much more easily. But they, of course, live in ways that were utterly appalling for just the centuries, which would have actually thought the same even just about how the chieftains of those peoples really lived by, what they ate, etc. This is what actually even makes the difference here in individual moral strength, meaning say what the Huns were habituated to live like was enough to shock even an average Romano-Germanic peasant for the incredibly meager resources that they had at their disposal, and that they knew to make the most of it. In fact, like another interesting way to destroy sort of classism in this regard is look at what the nomads were capable of doing compared to what the peasants in the sedentary world actually had. It's not like the peasants were starving to death, in fact, on a regular basis. They had actually plenty of resources compared to what, in fact, an average nomad really had. And so just think about how this, say, shapes you when it comes to even fighting capabilities, like being trained since childhood to fight or die, because otherwise you literally do starve to death, and or somebody comes to kill you anyway. You must know how to defend yourself in ways that the century world had delegated already to more civilized structures that, however, were also the sense to take matters in their own hands as far as the defense was concerned, because yes, that was a more effective way. The nomads didn't win the clash, but they let's say they also posed a significant threat, especially to those communities that were not so developed, and that did end for a while, as we will see now, under the same nomads. So during the first 3 centuries of the Christian era, the steppes of Eastern Europe enjoyed a period of relative stability. The Sarmatians held sway, albeit without the drive to expand. At least they tried, but of course there were the Romans on the other side. I made a video about the Eurasian steppe warfare times of the Romans, the Bosphorans, the Sarmatians, and of course there was a lot of activity there that we tend to, in fact, also forget in the aggressiveness of, like, it's not that the Sarmatians were just before the migration era, the collapse of the West, like nomads had been that unchallenging, right? Actually, there were some of these challenging threats, of course, and this is why in historical perspective it's evidently not much, even in fact, about these invaders that things change, if they change at all, because again, you don't see the nomads settling anywhere, if not in the populated areas. that did not have much of a consistency. The same empire had renounced to defend in the first place, and not much else. Like the Germans settle in the Roman world, and because they are already Romanized, actually. Even those groups that had been living across the so-called limes, that did not exist, by the way, had factually been under Roman influence, if not dominance, and they knew, of course, how to live there. They were not savages. They weren't, surely, in comparison to the nomads, and that were actually a pretty unsettling force. Even just anthropologically speaking, you have to imagine it was a terrifying vision when, I don't know, the Roman authorities were controlling migration on the Danube, etc. Look at these groups of Germans who were sort of fleeing because, say, of the arrival of God knows which other horde. Just think about even communication, language. How did these people communicate with one another? Of course, we would like to know that. We can't. Regarding, I don't know, even what their understanding of what these groups actually were. If you think about this, and especially in a world that was dominated by traditional awareness regarding divine punishments, like different scourges, plagues that God would send, in fact, in His wrath, to castigate humans, and like these real monsters, like Ammianus describes the Huns in so very racially unflattering terms, were seen really as they were, something radically different from anything that was probably even conceptually thought of. Like the Romans had never been particularly interested in the steppe peoples. They geographically ignored the existence of what is roughly today's Russia, and this is interesting because it's also very close, right? And those peoples, they knew perfectly about the Roman Empire. They had Roman artifacts reaching there, but of course they were so influent for the Roman imperial balances that, of course, the latter didn't properly care about them in the first place. And this is how, like, even shocking the contact with the nomads had sort of, certain nomads especially had come to be. As we were saying before, the Indo-European nomads had gradually been as savage as they were seen by the classical civilizations. Still, say, like, we know at least who they are, and we have always seen them there, we interact with them, like there is an idea of what the world is also around those places, but the rest is sort of like another thing. It's even like, again, it's not even peoples that you have learned to cooperate with. Of course, we would probably be surprised by the degree by which, say, also the Romans actually knew what the steppes really were. But it wasn't just like it was surely a select information for very particular purposes, rather than some, in fact, continuous cultural awareness that, of course, there is no evidence of in the sources. But hey, right, Rome and China were in direct contact. Like it was not really a too different scenario from, say, in terms of the intensity of contact between the two extremities of Eurasia, from the one of the Pax Mongolica in the 13th century. But in this case, in fact, there hadn't been an hegemonic empire of the steppes that anybody knew, right? It was rather like a much more fragmented and stable reality, and also a much less, let's say, willing to move one, because as long at least as the Indo-Europeans controlled the steppes, they sort of contain, in fact, the more repressively primitive Turco-Mongols that were relegated basically just in the northeastern extreme of the theater. Pretty much Indo-Europeans were everywhere, right? This period of relative stability began to change, as you know, around 375 AD, with the emergence of this new people from Central Asia, that are the Huns. So I made some videos about the Huns, not pretty satisfying ones as far as at least like I never talked in depth about what we know about genetics or this kind of stuff. It's not even that important, telling you the truth. These were prevalently Turks. There's no way around that. But they interestingly enough, interacted with Europe by hegemonizing groups of semi-nomads, right? That, as we've seen, were not happy of the Huns being there, but were at least hegemonized in a way that could be instrumental for breaking through the Roman frontier. Now, the nomadic warriors formed, as we've seen, a vast confederation under the leadership of their king and his loyal followers. And at the height of their empire, it was essentially structured, at least for the black Huns, because they're the white ones that are in northeast of the Sasanian Empire, and that actually are pretty nasty themselves there. We never talk about them, but we have to. So under the king of Attila, just sticking to the west, so we are in the 50s of the 5th century, the Huns dominated almost all of what was conventionally known in the Roman Empire as the Barbaricum. Right? Some say that there was even a subjection of the Scandinavian tribes to the Huns. We surely know that there is a massive influence from the steppes peoples, so properly Turkic linguistic suffixes, because again there's always the person who says, this Attila is not really, it's actually a Germanic name. Yes, because he came to be known through the Germanic subjects that were under him, the part of the Germans that stayed under the Huns, as opposed to those who were essentially within the Roman Empire already. But of course these were like very different people from the Germans, and also ethnogenetically, which was not even just a positive thing, because that the Hunnic Empire collapsed pretty quickly, and that it would have never had the capacity to destroy the Roman Empire, and especially they didn't have the intention of doing so, because that was a pretty fat cow to milk, especially for nomadic standards. And keeping the empire alive was very important for the Huns, because it made tributes arriving in a much more functional way. Like the Romans did a bit the same thing. They tried to compact these peoples outside so that they could avoid single tribes, single war bands, clans to be unruly in an anarchoid and threatening the empire. That would happen anyway, but as we were saying before, say like the German kingship, not just in a territorial sense, but probably in a political one, is by scale achieved by the Romans, right? What we call the Visigoths were of Alaric, that was the true first king in that sense, were essentially the Roman army of the Illyricum. The Germans had been settled just there in place of the Roman army, and they had also gotten pretty Romanized by the simple fact that they were ruling over a Roman province with all the Roman fabricae we were talking about, late imperial armories the other day. Well, the Huns were something different, and this is also very well showed by, in fact, the difference between the Germans who stayed under them as opposed to those who were under the Romans. There is probably different zootechnical capacities, different think about skull deformation. There is, in fact, even in onomastic differences, probably a more steppe-like character of these populations. There are many more proper reiter in the steppe sense, horse archers, right? We see that they buried their dead in this way. I talked recently about the Heergerät Vestis Vedlica. We didn't distinguish the things too much, but there is some significant difference between these peoples. Also, in fact, in the degree of, for example, of cavalry development, peoples like the Goths, the Longobards were famously much more equestrianly developed than, say, the Franks, or even less the Anglo-Saxons, for obvious many reasons. But the impact is present. Of course, it's not to say that this nomadic influence didn't spill over into the Roman Empire. This happened in so many ways, and through the same Iranians, the same Indo-Europeans who had, of course, like escaped in part this Turkic invasion. And by the way, it was dramatic. Like what I always stress about the migration here is not that the new conquerors had so much great living standards than those who were conquered at all. Everybody was in utter crisis. They were running out of resources. This, say, Turkic sweeping of the steppes was incredibly damaging, right? And in relative terms, even much greater than what happened in the sanitary world, because the latter at least had resources that, yes, were like at least the productive system was damaged, but resources would keep growing, literally, with crops and all. But in the steppes, the damage in proportion was greater, right? Which is also oddly how, for example, the Slavs, as we'll see now, managed to populate dramatically in proportion, like sowing their seed in an area that had depopulated, had left, right? Being left empty mostly by the Germans, who had occupied in the previous centuries. There were other peoples before that, and of course there weren't just these Slavs, and we won't see it because this is an issue. Even there you see that the socialist propaganda said yes, that these Slavs originally were all like free peasants, like Soviets that were spreading like without hierarchy or whatever. This is absolutely not the case, but don't underestimate the traumatically and violently brutal underdevelopment and primitivity of Central and Eastern Europe during the migration era. It's not something you can afford to kid with metaphysically as an individual, right? Because this has, in fact, molded Europe forever. You cannot alter it. So you cannot explain half of European history if you don't properly get this thing right. And of course, yes, there were confederacies, there were elites, there were aristocracies. That's not a doubt. But things were much more miserable than we think. In fact, that's also what we were saying before, that we tend to, first of all, not picture the idea that there is something called Central Europe, right? That is not Eastern Europe, right? And that is not Western Europe, right? There are three distinct things. And in part they overlap to what we were saying before, like Romans, Germans, steppes. The Slavs emerge from within mostly like an Eastern Central European context for how it would later come to stabilize, not from the steppe. But the sense is that there is a divide even between Central and Eastern Europe, right? And it cannot be. This is more evident in the later Middle Ages, but it's here also because we know practically nothing, as you know, in a documentary sense about Eastern Europe during the migration era, right? We know something about what is mostly, in fact, today's the Hungarian plain, like the Western Slavic countries, like because there had been something, right? Which is also, when you look at it through the lens also of the Franks centuries later, something very unstable, something very poor, something very scarcely developed, to say the least. But if one does not start with this clear distinction between these areas and the differences between them in development, that is the hard thing, because modern people, like any people, does not want to hear, of course, that their country is more or less developed than another, but it's the truth, but you cannot hide it. You must understand that history is about this. If you're not able to accept it, you will never fix it. It's useless to get into history in the first place. So, going back to the Huns, of course, such a concentration of power that we have seen required extraordinary resources to maintain its cohesion. And as more warriors flocked to Attila's banner, so did the need for plunder and riches to appease them, because there was literally no other mean. There was no state. The Huns, just like the Avars, the Magyars, would all create this sort of ring forts where they stored their loot, etc. And so imagine just looting the Roman Empire as opposed to some other stinky tribe out there into the middle of nowhere. What kind of excitement and fantasy would activate, especially think about how relevant Attila's memories, as we were saying, among the Germans. Also in the Nibelungenlied, there is the story that, it's a well-founded theory, that Attila in the Nibelungenlied was actually not Attila, but some Huns of those that Aetius used to destroy the Burgundian kingdom, deporting the Burgundians from the Middle Rhine, Worms, etc., to Sepaudia, where they would be eventually settled as a diminished people. Like the Burgundians had already been beaten by different other groups, and that's why they were so shy in between, like on the Rhine, like awaiting whether to fall into or in between the Huns and the Romans, and that's also why Aetius sort of got pissed at some point and did what it did. But still, how important it was also throughout the Middle Ages for the Central European and Middle European mentality, what the Huns had been. Because eventually the Germans would rebel to the Huns, and there was the Battle of Nedau. That is, again, we know very few about that, but essentially almost all the Germans that participated into that clash were same Attila's had been the same Hunnic subjects, right? So this is after Attila's death, of course, but we know of some groups that at least are not mentioned for that battle, and that also probably remained, because there was also Attila's son who ruled for a while, and apparently the Longobards remained for a longer time than all the other Germans under the Huns, at least the recognizable German groups that eventually didn't flow into some bigger group, like I'd say what we call the Ostrogoths, for example. They were pretty big for migration era standards when they recompacted in the Illyricum and eventually moved into Italy. The same goes for the Longobards. By the way, the place also like which these peoples migrated were always the gates of Italy. Like it's basically the Pannonian Plain. If you look at the Indo-European invasion of Italy, also happened from there. This is true also for the nomads or the semi-nomads. It's always the same place. The Huns, the Ostrogoths, the Longobards, everybody stopped there at Avoid because it was a very strategic location. Also, from a Hunnic perspective, they could pillage both the east and the west of Rome, and there wasn't any major power around, right? At least the Byzantines were Eastern Rome, but like in the immediacy, right? Those were pretty stretched places also for the imperial armies to operate, both from Constantinople and even from Italy. So that eventually, the group dissolves out of probably also this, that they could keep on raiding, but they would exhaust themselves in the process. Like the Roman civilization, late antiquity, was not going to collapse, right? The German federati in the Roman Empire were not allowing their equivalent from the Hunnic side to just break through, right? In part, they had been exploiting the disaster. For example, if you look at the famous 406th frozen Rhine crossing, the Franks sort of stood in the way of all these, mostly Germans, Iranians, that were trying to flee the Huns in that domino effect. Then the dam was broken, and the Franks said, if everybody has broken through Gaul and Spain, let's grab some land for ourselves. Or at least they sort of remained Roman allies later on. So as we were saying before, the only reason why there was a Hunnic empire in the sense we intent also with these groups of peoples that were not Turkic at large, but even if they had been hegemonized by this leader who was that ruthlessly ferocious, was the Roman Empire. I mean, the riches came from there, and those were the only means to sustain such a dominion. So either as a result of war and conquest, or as tributes paid by the Romans under treaties negotiated under Hunnic pressure. And paying tributes had always been a thing, right? It's not maybe orientatively the best indicator of political, strategical superiority, but it was normal, as it still is, for great powers to simply buy the temporary peace or even friendship with a particular smaller power, and because these do not count as much, you can't spend that amount of money for doing so. Then, just on the longer run, you have to think about some other idea. But if at least the power ratios remain unaltered, it's also something that can last for a while. The Byzantine writer Priscus, who visited the Hunnic court as an ambassador, left behind a vivid description of life at Attila's court, a cosmopolitan center of barbarian aristocracy characterized by close ties with the Roman world as well. Of course, Rome was the ultimate holy center of the world. There was no other metaphysical compass, except China, as we've seen, but the Huns had migrated exactly from on the other end. At some point, more on the origins of the Huns in another video. However, as success bred increased demands and needs, Attila was forced to undertake increasingly ambitious campaigns, such as his invasion of Gaul in 451, one of Italy the year after, which resulted in the destruction of the city of Aquileia, and just apparently, at least according to the sources, because one wall of the city had crumbled by itself because, the general, shortcoming in the public administration of the Roman world, and not because the Huns, and generally speaking, nomadic peoples were that good at polyascetics. Admittedly, in Gaul, the Huns made a mess. There were, however, some centers that resisted successfully against these invaders. Were mostly about, again, looting, raiding, coming back home in the Hungarian steppe, and repeating that in different places, right? Being sure that you wouldn't exhaust the resources you could extract, because otherwise it would have been a wasted campaign in a certain theater, or it could have destabilized further the same empire you could rely on for this kind of quick cash that was, however, hardly won anyway. And we know how the story went. Following Attila's death in 453, the entire system of the Hunnic Empire collapsed within a few years. Right? Are the Huns overrated? Definitely. At least in the the archetypal symbol that we made of them, of the terrible, the scourge of God, these monsters from the steppes. That is true. It's a true picture, but this doesn't mean that they were overwhelmingly effective. There were this enormous power to be reckoned with. I mean, for example, the Avars were much more impressive. I mean, from a strictly military point of view. The Byzantines were quite complementary against these people who also threatened. By the way, a nomadic people having, however, hell of polyascetic means, which tells you something. With the Sino-Avar trebuchet, etc., they would have besieged the same Constantinople, risking to capture it together with the Slavic infantrymen that followed this, as we'll see now, so-called shepherds of peace. In our history, we didn't actually talk too much about the Avars ever in Schwerpunkt, and this depends on the cycle to some extent, but they really deserve. We have to deepen way more, we have to start properly all the army organization, tactics, military historical units, etc. Battles as well. And just basic history about them, because they really constitute, after a century after the Huns, this another and more powerful entity, at least in the in the level of specific weight of regional threat they could pose. In fact, the scenario has changed. So similar characteristics emerging in roughly the same region, because it was again the best place where the nomads could settle. So specifically in the steppes of modern-day Hungary. And the reason why the Avars were more threatening in the sense that the Huns is that the Huns were, as we've seen, sort of catalyzing in part the same migration process of a multitude of peoples and more politically compact ones like the ones of the Germanic confederacies against Rome. Hence they had sort of wings on their shoulders as far as, say, pushing further towards this frontier was concerned, was convincing these people to do it. If you think about it, you're basically pushing some, of course it wasn't allowing the subjects to simply settle in the empire, but the idea is that breaking through, because that's what the Germans want and obtain after Attila, right? But there was a way to in fact float on this basis and to gain more power in the way that we've seen. With the Avars, we are in probably the post-antique context, because after the Gothic War, we are in the mid-6th century, you have probably the contraction, the end of antiquity, especially in these areas for good. And our concentration is capable of it's incredible. They poured an incredible amount of strength into the Pannonian Basin that was so compact that could strike the Byzantine Empire as a center of power, and so at that point ruling over it, and or a bit like the Bulgarians would do later on the Balkans, as it was creating an empire, immense empire, similar in fact to the one of the first Bulgarian one later, but centered in Pannonian Basin, expanding also into Merovingian Germany, harassing northeastern Italy, and therefore having greater ambitions. The Avars had used the Slavs that were again emerging after the German wave, and they weren't so politically cohesive. But there were many apparently, and they would be literally forced also by the Avars to relocate, to be employed as their knights, attendants, like pioneers, mostly for siege warfare against the Byzantines. That's how they could achieve that as well. This naturally was possible because just the general populations, Slavicide or not, over which the Avars could extend some control, were already, in spite of the general poverty, capable, in fact, or just looking towards the same predatory attainment against the more fertile lands in the Mediterranean, because at least in the Byzantine world, antiquity is not dying until at least the Islamic invasions. And as such, they had all the reason to push against Constantinople, because the Avars were also at that point, unlike the Huns, comfortable with the fact that none of these subjects would have had the political compaction to simply substitute itself or turn against them, in the case, for example, Constantinople had fallen. That would have been helping dramatically the Avars. Naturally, there were still the Persians at this point as a solid empire, so it's really all a very complicated thing. So the Avar Khaganate formed an alliance with the Longobards against the Gepids. As you know, that's how the Avars entered the Carpathian Basin. The Gepids were subsequently defeated, and the Longobards would invade Italy in 568. Part of the Gepids were brought, including Alboin's wife and apparent killer, Rosmund, to Italy, but also many Gepids remained in the Carpathian Basin as essentially Avar subjects, made a video about the Gepids if you're interested. It's also about the Longobards, even though we lack this specific time in depth. I may cover it soon. And following this, so the Longobards abandoned the Pannonian Basin, where they were settled from at least the on the right bank of the Danube, so on the more civilized part. They controlled parts of Moravia still, etc. From the Balaton Lake, they moved into Italy, leaving a gap that was essentially filled by the Avars. As we were saying before, there were some agreements between the two in case of failed Longobards settlement in the peninsula. It was in the hands of the empire, but essentially unguarded. And likely, actually, the Byzantines were the ones who called the Longobards into Italy at that very point, and the thing just went out of hand more than else. And so, following the Gepids were destroyed jointly by the Avars and the Longobards, after which Bayan and the Avars seized control completely of this broader region. So their empire underwent a similar trajectory to that of the Huns. By the way, it should be pointed out that by the time the Gepids were destroyed, the Avars were not so strong as the ones of a couple of generations later. Essentially, it's the peak of our powers at the beginning of the 7th century, right? And that's, which is also like when they besieged Constantinople in 626, and they originally they were divided. They were a confederacy, but say every group settled bit in scattered order, and so there wasn't like a cohesive Khaganate like the one we know later. So you shouldn't simply say, "Oh well, the Avars cheated." Say the Avars entered, just crushed everybody. No, right? They weren't immediately that overwhelming threat that it seems the Gepids did fight. It was mostly the Longobard-Avar alliance that made the thing more easily. But we know that there were multiple battles, and that the Gepids were, because at least the Longobard tradition talks only about one battle, at least in the war against the Avars, but we know from some Gepid refugees in Constantinople, because at this point Constantinople was actually supporting the Gepids, that there had been multiple battles. And that's unfortunately, like as we were saying before, in the absence of written information, really we can't reconstruct what really happened there, where we do not know the exact locations of the main engagements. But we understand more or less what it was about. So the Avars finally coalesced, right? This was an interesting process, because it happened, by the way, after they settled down. And in part, again, they had kept receiving groups from the outside, so it's a complex issue, telling the truth. They expanded, integrating various war bands. Subsequently, they launched increasingly ambitious campaigns, including the siege of Constantinople, 626, and finally, after failing to capture the Byzantine capital, their power really began to wane. And this is exactly what we were talking about before, like these ultra-cocky steppes, empires, really don't last long, right? They gradually fade away, they start sedentarizing, and they don't see the point of leaving as they had done before, but they don't really have the culture and properly the basis, the surplus, but also the political preconditions to evolve into something more compact. Unless they have been very successful to some other extent. For example, the Magyars would succeed later, but these places also change. Like the 6th century is not the 9th century, right? In Europe, even in these areas. So what happened with the Avars, of course, is that if you don't have a leadership capable of keeping to offend your neighbors, if not at a very, say, provincial level, you can't fuel the state that would be necessary to make this people sort of go on, right? And so, unlike the Huns, the Avars did retain a significant amount of power, but by the time of Charlemagne, they were unable to stop the Frankish armies that eventually destroyed the Avar Khaganate, of which there was practically no trace afterwards. I mean, yes, there were groups. We know that the Avars survived, even they were eventually subsumed by other groups, but they had who were these people? Like, it's not that the local territory had been literally replenished with Avars from the migration. It was plenty of locals that had eventually sort of become Avar, in the sense that they were subject to them, and they had partly lost their previous identity, because that had stemmed from, at least politically, a very fragmented migration era context where you couldn't quite, there was no one when the Avars arrived. As we've seen, the Gepids had been crushed, the Longobards left. Yes, there were people there descending from a bit everyone there, the Celts, the Romans. The Avars themselves bring the Slavs, that are actually the main ethnic group here that genetically makes up the surroundings, that ethnically made up the surroundings of Stratum, at least for whatever that meant, because there wasn't like a collective Slavic homogeneous identity, or like just those had been invaders as well, like, so they weren't making up the majority, especially in the areas that had formerly been part of the Roman Empire, that they would become culturally homogeneous, even in some of them, but unless we're talking properly about some deserted areas that were repopulated just with them, which is not, in fact, also the most relevant ones in at least in this period, that we still have to look at under the Avars. They were really the sense, and of course there had been lots of peoples from the steppes that had been part of the Avar confederacy before, like, so it was a very mixed reality, but much less than one could say extremely think. There was always, like in the sanitary world, a prevalence of the locals in the first place. So unlike the Huns and the Magyars, who invaded Western territories, the Avars also did not launch large-scale invasions into Western countries. Friuli may be the exception, but again, it's just next door across the Alps, and it's just a provincial reality. Instead, they focused on plundering the Balkan provinces of the Byzantine Empire, because it was sort of the more profitable area, the one that, as we've seen, could exploit also the local support, essentially the Balkan hinterland, that had been more just rebellious towards the empire, also less productive, etc., but for this reason more attracted, just like the Avars, so having something in common with them, to the local riches. And as the Avars were building their empire, another significant process was underway. As we've seen, the Slavic expansion that would have had this far-reaching and profound consequences throughout Europe, that are underestimated, that are a bit mysterious as well. Like, again, mystery is not the right word when we talk about history, but again, there are different versions of how the Slavic migrations actually occurred. The extremes are, again, the idea that this was sort of a people coming up of the Pripyat marshes, or forests better, when the migration era had cooled down, peoples had passed, and they started literally to overwhelm demographically every place that had remained empty. And sort of Slavicized everything. Everybody began to speak Slav. That's it. The other vision is instead, no, these were just, basically the same locals who, like, there are people who even deny the fact that the, the Slavic migration existed. Of course, that doesn't make sense, but it's mostly because of saying, and you know what I'm talking about in the general rhetoric and propaganda, like, no, we were here from 300 billion years ago and we were the same people, and all this kind of story. And definitely there were aristocracies, there were populations, but we do see that at an archaeological level, that first of all, especially the Balkan area, the Danube, there are some still the places where there's a greater continuity. Like there have been cities, churches, like people lived like in that sedentary agricultural fashion. There was military infrastructure, so yes, they were not particularly developed places, but we can sort of track them apart, and we see that the Slavs basically come to blend in some way. It's not easy to understand how exactly in precise quantitative terms, but we definitely see eventually the result, historically, culturally, linguistically, genetically, right? Things did really change. Things weren't like that before. And of course, the Slavs were not just, again, some passive people that was shepherded by the Turks across Europe. They expanded in so many different directions. And if you look at the north, say the Western Slavs and the Eastern Slavs, they had hardly anything to do with the Avars, for example. Unlike the Southern Slavs that surely were in between many fires. And this is important because whoever settled in the Pannonian Basin was not, say, in terms of these large nomadic groups, was essentially breaking the Slavic unity historically, right? This is special. Like until the Magyars arrived, it was still possible to have just a link between places like Moravia, whichever it was. Actually, this is the most contentious, but possible reality that Moravia was actually not today's Moravia historically, but rather some place in northern Serbia. That was linked at that point, however, with through the Pannonian Slavs and, in fact, Moravia with that Western Slavic context. But the Magyars arrive, and the Yugoslavs essentially are born, like the sense that there's a divide because of the Hungarians in between. But also the Hungarians are not exactly just like they're not Slavs, but of course there is a lot there underneath about it as well. And again, it's very complicated to even just approximate, because of course you can distinguish different places, different areas. The same Magyars, as you know, as these other steppes rulers, had tended to rule over different provinces, telling the truth. So not just the ones that were more evidently not, for example, Hungarian in later times. In fact, these ones, which it ain't, by the way, until the 6th century that the term Slav first appears in written records, right? And it is initially associated with small groups of peasants or pillagers, fundamentally, rather than a powerful, right, people, prominent leaders, something of this kind. And this is, again, fitting the general narrative that, of course, these were sort of smaller groups compared to the ones the German had been in the Confederate migration phase. And despite this relatively low profile, just 3 generations later, by the mid-7th century, much of this immense area, right, that stretches from the Baltic to the Aegean, seems to have been inhabited by Slavs. So this means, in a, say, also more strictly political and military senses, demographically, ethnically is legitimately a matter of debate, but there were phenomena of this kind. There were also groups, by the way, of Slavs that had been migrating a bit on their own, and or under, for example, the guidance of some peoples that were escaping from the Huns list. For example, we think that the Serbs had originated from essentially an Iranian leadership that resettled in places like Sorabia, in fact, that came to be, inhabited by Slavs, etc. And this group was eventually called, in part, to counter the Avars in the Balkans by the Byzantines, which was something desirable for both terms of land and defense, respectively. And that would originate like this important Yugoslavian people. Now, this phenomenon remains one of the enduring enigmas of European history, and also because of this extremely scarce amount of evidence. Maybe not extremely, but like a strongly, scarce amount of evidence. We're not faced with tales of glorious conquests or dramatic mass migrations. And one of the reasons actually stems from the fact that, first of all, the Slavs did not really write at this point. But more than else, this went in parallel with the fact that they didn't have really a real statehood. They had different clans, different tribes, more or less, cooperating with one another, but it's obvious that you wouldn't have the foundation of a state over a single people, even for the later states that developed in the High Middle Ages, to record this as a collective enterprise. So this is not a scam. I mean, the Slavic migration, some people presume, it's not, again, the communistic version of the story of this peaceful agrarian, egalitarian population. But of course, this in fact also this ethnic and cultural hegemonies is actually to be found. It's less recognizable. It's less, distinguishable even from the rest of the population, but the broader picture does not lie, these peoples did not, exist as such with that language, with that ethnic profile. And consider that, as you've seen, these were areas that had been heavily populated, crossed, devastated during the migration era. So it's obvious that so much would change in there, and that even, a middle-sized nation, or peoples that had somehow emerged from a similar ethno-linguistical pool, would be able to make a greater ethnic impact in relative terms, also in such vast area, because of course there were few people to begin with, and that they would also remain few, and so they had also to stretch out and replace again, other groups that had moved away. And this is very interesting because we do find the Slavs catching, the moment, and for example moving under the Avars or under the Germans in certain contexts. We know this to a fair degree genetically as well. And we do know that they arrive. There is a difference. There is some proper material culture that changes. Everything is traceable. Again, it's not a masquerade. Truly, it was a slow, uncoordinated, almost incremental, however, expansion that transformed this wide area. And surely, more fundamentally, for this very reason, the emptiness of the spaces to an important degree compared to post-Roman Europe, then the Germans transformed Western Europe. The Germans essentially settled with groups of most 100,000 people, right, or at a time, as a single group, confederate people, into regional pools of few million people. So they were important, but they didn't replace the locals. They essentially almost all the, at least at the regional level, all the once Romance places were to remain Romance even after the German migration. Only Britain, essentially in the West, had this Germanic, say, prevalence, at least also in a cultural sense, after the Anglo-Saxon invasions, because the land had never been particularly Romanized. The locals were not that capable of posing a resistance because of this prior Romano-Brittonic sort of melange. And so the Anglo-Saxons came to dictate a bit the models of what this collective identity had to be. The Slavs, of course, do the same. There are people that have always lived there, and they simply get subsumed by these elites. In fact, are warlike, are aristocratic. They are on the move themselves. All right, they don't just carry agricultural tools. They carry weapons. All right, and so they do command, they do mold, they do impose sort of their own culture anyway, and language, and that's also what sort of the primary indicator, after all, and it doesn't have to be underestimated. From the Elbe River to the Peloponnese, from the Eastern Alps to the surroundings of Constantinople, the Slavs imposed their simple way of life. It's obviously interesting to look at all these groups individually. I made lots of videos about these groups in my historical regions series. We talked about the Pannonian Slavs. We observed also, like for example, during the Ostsiedlung, how this came to happen, like how some regions were sort of Germanized later on. Again, how this, of course, intertwined with the nomadic settlement. It's an interesting, even if underdocumented, story. The most prevalent explanation for this phenomenon is that the Slavs were already a significant population when they first appeared in Western records. It's possible that they inherited the legacy of the enigmatic Veneti, for example, from the pre-Christian era, as the Germans refers to the Slavs as Veneti or Venden, in fact. However, we have no definitive proof to support this theory either, because that was just one group to stay out there, and we don't know what happened to them during the migration era, and also who actually moved, right, from where. There's more a broader area that we think is connected, in fact, with the spring of the Slavic peoples, of this Proto-Slavic population that existed, of course, there at the time of the Veneti, at the time, but they do not overlap geographically, at least as far as we can see. Late ancient texts mention numerous tribes active in the region, but prior to around the mid-6th century, there is no mention of either the Slavs or the Vends. Therefore, we cannot assume that large groups of Slavs existed in isolation, of course, only to suddenly invade Central Eastern Europe. Instead, it appears that Slavic ways of life and identity spread rapidly among populations of diverse origin, indicating a social and cultural phenomenon rather than strictly like an ethnic or political one. However, it is possible to some degree again that the area around the Pripyat forests actually hosted some population and eventually sprang from there, as again no further settlement, at least in great numbers, would take place in that forest area, in fact, because the steppes peoples did not like to settle in the forest. It didn't make sense. It was was against logic, right? There were less resources, etc. So it was difficult even to just simply sell. Of course, single lords, single war bands would have done it. As we've seen, some refugees that were trying to escape the very steppe corridor that was, in fact, infested by the new arrivals. But of course, we can imagine some group of different, also tribal origin that may have been shattered by the same migration, right? Had, of course, important numbers of both, let's say, of other peoples from the migration, not just also peoples that were eventually taken over by them in other places when they settled down there. That sort of began to expand, in fact, in the middle of almost nowhere, and for this reason we don't know too much about, right? In fact, as I was saying before, there is probably an area of the classical radar that is pretty obscure to us, because it doesn't really provide with any relevant, say, certainty regarding really who inhabited where. Unlike the Germanic context, there was no lavish tombs or prominent settlements among the Slavs, right? Instead, life remained relatively primitive, with a few archaeological remains that would indicate their presence in many regions. Of course, there was an aristocracy, as we said, there was some wealth, but it was much less than, by concentration, than the one, say, among the that had existed among the German peoples. And the Slavic type of life facilitated further the integration of populations under expansionist forces, because the Slavs were not seen even as too challenging, right? Nor peoples that were actually just come to impose themselves. They once settling, they would have had to defend as they would from other steppes peoples who were active around the new abodes. And this is, in fact, sort of an underappreciated aspect, that the nomads kept destabilizing heavily the way of life of the sedentaries in this area, right? A steppe corridor from Ukraine to the Danubian Valley and into the Hungarian plain remained incredibly frequented by nomads that kept being settled there, also as major groups had done so. Also for reasons of stiffening central power that, as we've seen, was meager, and say, fueling the competition between the local groups at Similia. And the sedentaries all around, that here were principally this mix of Slavs and pre-existing populations, were just to essentially pair themselves, to actually being subjected most of the times to the steppes rulers, and as such really coping with the meager income and the tributes they had to pay, the military service they had also to provide. And I made a video about Slavic warfare from the Strategicon, which is incredibly enlightening and shows you how smart they were, by the way, with those scarce resources to cope also with the Byzantine military that you didn't have to kid with, because these nomads could launch raids deep into Byzantine territory, but the Byzantines would do, at least in the Balkans, where the Slavs had come to inhabit. But as we've seen, they were present up to Greece, right? The Slavs took boats and crossed into North Africa at some point, at Similia. Would, in fact, fall on the same populations. And so it was devastating. It really hampered, as we were saying before, that process of statalization that, as we've seen also in some videos about the Croats, the Serbs, the Bulgars, took like a very long time before kicking in some sort of seriously stable basis. So only gradually, in fact, from the 8th century onwards, did Slavic societies on the periphery of the Byzantine Empire and Frankish kingdom, so the closest to civilization, begin to open up to external influences, at least becoming part of a Christian civilization, and with that truly having the foundation of real states, really stable political territorial entities that would have not otherwise, like up to that point, had not really had the means of coalescing. Right, they had done so, but they had remained in this precarious status, and this comes in parallel with lots of other events of backs and forths. There are some statual experiments that get crushed. Look at Serbia, look at Great Moravia. Instability is always there, but there is also some, from the lower level, some stratification that occurs, and over time allows for more stable powers to affirm themselves, unavoidably connecting themselves with the great great cultures that existed in Europe at the time. It's either the Roman Catholic, Frankish one, or the Byzantine Orthodox one, that, in spite of the fact that we're not yet divided formally as a church, but de facto they were, would in fact contend themselves also the evangelization of these peoples. And I made multiple videos on this. If you search for the evangelization of Europe playlist, you will find plenty of that stuff. And it's a long way. It's a long way. That's why we're here. We're getting too far from the migration era. Yet in these places, hardly ever ends. Right? If you look at all, say, these nomadic peoples knocking at the door, so it's a much more challenging reality. It's sort of more frontier area, right? And it couldn't be otherwise. It had been from a long time, continued to be, but at the end of the day, this sedentary side prevails, right? And it does because it was always sort of, I mean, this is at least in the migration era the moment of greater steppe influence, but also, as we've seen, the one of steppe sedentarization, say, or steppe peoples sedentarization as well. So we'll keep talking about this. For today, I, however, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.